Hello and welcome back to another episode of They Don't Teach This in Law School. I'm your host, Charlie Mann of law firm Alchemy, and my guest today fills a very unique gap in a lot of law firms' portfolio of vendors, companies that they work with, because the way that she handles what we're going to talk about is definitely different from the standard idea of what you might hear called a recruiter. And as you'll find, she doesn't consider herself a recruiter. She considers herself a hiring advisor. And based on what I've come to know about her, I would absolutely agree. So we have the hiring advisor from Your Brand Networker, Erin Andersen. Erin, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today.
So Erin, answer the question. What's the one thing they don't teach you in law school?
Sure. It's really about part of hiring, but really the culture behind hiring in a team. So a lot of the times you're taught maybe team leadership and how to structure a firm or what your place is going to be in a larger law firm. But often we're not covering actually what is the strategy behind hiring for these firms and what do we need to look for so that we're increasing retention long term, especially with new hires. So, this might not necessarily be a course, but I think it would be advantageous for law schools to bring in people like myself or either, even other people that have led firms for a long time to talk about retention strategies, not only for, being in the place of hiring, but also what should you look for a law firm in the first time that you're actually looking for one and then beyond the rest of your career.
Interesting. Okay. So from the perspective of a law firm owner, you hear this, you hear about hiring. A lot of hiring is done through some form of, as my buddy Tim Summeroth would say, a lot of hiring when you're hungry, as opposed to maybe planned acquisition of team members. I can imagine a lot of compounding factors like that lead to degradation in the cultural sanctity of
Mm.
a law firm. And it seems like you're coming in to help preserve or even grow that. So when you come into a law firm, what are some of the core issues that you see that cause that problem you've identified?
Yeah, usually retention number one. So, it's very common for a new hire. Two associates just resigned, or I have to get rid of, in quotes, two associates. They're not working because they don't have the work ethic, for example.
Mm.
Something else that I see a lot is new firms that are just starting. How cheap can I get a new hire? That's a question I hear a lot. And so they've
Hmm.
essentially built a firm on hiring cheap talent, which clearly would not stay long term. And so they're not following market rates. I think sometimes law firms go in open because maybe they find a partner that would be a great opportunity, but they don't necessarily think of the cost of the hires, believe it or not. And so they have all of this work coming in, but they can't necessarily always afford all of the staff to back it up. And I see that being one of the main issues. And so it's actually great for a firm to come and have this conversation months ahead of the timeline that they may want to hire, because they may find based on salary that they need to network and bring more work in, or even wait a little bit longer in the year to bring on a better hire that's going to be more sustainable for them.
So let me zoom in on one of the first things you mentioned there, which is retention. That is
Yeah,
certainly something that people would prefer to address up front. I'm curious
sure.
from your perspective, being someone who is a hiring advisor, and again, the term that most people here thrown around is recruiter. And we'll take a moment here soon to talk about why it's a different nomenclature that you use.
Sure.
But that retention issue, how
Mm.
are you helping to solve that at the beginning of the process?
Yeah, so I do some work around culture if the firm chooses. They don't have to, but I usually advise on doing like culture surveys, for example, where I will do that with the partners and other employees. I also encourage me speaking to other people who have been at the firm for a while to ask them why they have stayed. It's really helpful for me to see multiple perspectives, right? A partner, all of us as small business owners, we have a lot of pride and we probably think we do a great job at managing our employees. But if you ask them, I'm sure there's obviously things that we can improve on, and very similar into a law firm. Or maybe, I had a conversation yesterday with somebody and I said, have you ever asked your employees during an annual review why it is that they're here? And they're like, not really. That's a great time to assess, how can we sell this firm and talk about it from a perspective of why you should work here. And I find that's, I do this intake specifically for the job post. One of the number one things I always hear is, when I'm interviewing candidates, are like, the job post really, it made me want to apply for this job. And when I ask why, it's following the market trend of talking about what a law firm is going to give them first versus just what's being required. And that's
Mm.
where I see more people start to become interested in the position.
Talk to me a little bit more about that idea of what the law firm is going to do for me first.
Sure. So, at every top of a job description, there's always that summary of the firm, what it is that, who they are. And usually, when a law firm sends me their existing job description, it's all of their accolades, which is great because obviously an applicant is looking at that as wow, this is a great place to work. I'm going to gain a great reputation here. But what is it that we're going to give them? So, for example, I was recently hiring for a firm where they're looking for an associate that's going to be able to get experiences on multiple different areas of law. That's not overly common, but that's attractive to many people. So, we need to say
Mm.
that at the top of the job post versus burying it under responsibilities because it's what's going to separate them out from every other law firm.
Yeah, that's a difficult mindset shift for a lot of firm owners where they look at that type of idea that you're talking about, Erin, and they say, "Oh, that's the self-obsessed millennials and Gen
Yeah.
Z who want to know what's in it for them instead of,
Yeah.
it's the old JFK quote, that's not, what you could do for your country." So
Sure.
that's not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And that's
Yeah.
kind of what it feels like culturally. So I'm curious when you're talking to firm owners, do you ever have to deal with that? And if so, how do you help change their minds?
Yeah, I think it's more of like sometimes it's more like pulling teeth, right? Of getting it out of them. It's
Right.
not that they're resistant to doing it so much. I think when I compare and send them, I always send market comps. So when I'm sending them other job descriptions and then they see their new job description, it's very clear as to why we're doing this. And they can understand from an applicant perspective, oh, I can see why I would apply to this, but it's
Right.
more getting it out of them because they haven't really had the conversation around culture yet. They're smaller firms. I'm certified in workplace culture. I do this work outside of just the recruiting and hiring. And so at this point, frankly, it probably hasn't been in the budget or the time, right? Even the
Mm.
time perspective of building out a firm that they've had the ability to work on their culture. And so sometimes I also hear them say it's in the missions and value statement on our website, which is very different from culture. So I
Right.
actually find that it becomes a really great learning lesson in the long run. And then also, it's an opportunity for us maybe to do some further culture work once we start onboarding these new employees. And it's something for them to start thinking about as they continue to grow their firm.
I know that everyone tends to have a preferred sort of culture indexing tool. Strength finders, Colby. Some people love the Myers-Briggs still, which absolutely baffles me because on average, I think it's like 30% of people have their profile changed 30 days after taking it. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff there. So I'm curious, when you come in and you're doing this like culture profiling, do you have any preferred tools, preferred methodology, and how do you even out that like great gradation of certain profiles may shift over time, etc.?
Sure. Yeah, I don't use any of the standard assessments. However, if they have already done themselves, as many people have, I will take it into consideration. But I was certified in culture talk. And so there are those surveys that if they choose to do the more culture extensive
Mm.
work, then that's something that I would do before we even begin hiring if there's time. Granted, sometimes firms come to me and they have, we need to hire in under 30 days.
I'm sure.
That's a little bit harder, right? But those culture surveys are distributed to each person at the law firm, and then I'm able to analyze the results and really find out what is it that not only what is the personality, but how do people work together, which I feel like a lot of personality assessments don't cover to that extent.
Huh.
And then we can also use that with the new hire. So either before that they are hired or after for the onboarding process.
Gotcha. Okay, let's revisit that whole before we talk more tactical stuff here, that recruiter versus hiring advisor thing. So I assume then there's something about the quote unquote recruiter model that
Yeah.
maybe doesn't jive with you well. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. I found when I was starting this that a lot of recruiters I heard a lot of complaints about recruiters that they were
Sure.
taking a lot of time, right? Like maybe 6 months, and all of these small firms. I mostly work with small and medium-sized firms. They need the talent when they need the talent. It's not next August for a new class of associates. They need it when they need it. And so they were wasting a lot of time on signing contracts with recruiters, and they were hiring for several different roles. So what starts to happen is on a general recruiter
Hmm.
model, you are paid a commission of the salary. So recruiters, if they have a ton of positions right now that they're recruiting for, they're spending more times on the senior roles that they can get paid higher versus maybe you need a legal assistant immediately and now it's taking too much
Right.
time. So I work off a flat rate basis and it's the same for all hires. So there isn't a conflict of interest. Another thing that I find is a lot of recruiters don't actually conduct that first round interview or a scanner, as we like to call it. That tends to be more of an internal corporate model. And so I've taken that and I conduct the scanners to save the firm a lot of time. I've interviewed people from Ivy League schools and had great resumes. And when I got on an interview, it's not that they didn't have the skill set, they did not have the personality that the firm was looking for,
Right.
and that was really important. And then I would say the third thing that's very different is the way that I write a job description, which sounds quite simple, but it's what's attracting the right candidate in the first place. So it's saving us a lot of time. I can analyze on LinkedIn Recruiter how many views I'm getting for a position and how many people are applying. And I want that number to be quite small because I want people to, be clear as day when they read a job description. Maybe this isn't for me. And going along with that, I'm transparent with salary. So when a candidate
Hmm.
is looking at a role, whether you're in a transparent salary state or not, it's great to actually put the range because there's no point in going through an interview process with somebody that wants 50 or 100 more for a role if that's not what's budgeted, especially for a smaller firm.
So from like a 30,000 foot level, when you talk about writing job descriptions in a different way, that's something that most people would take for granted or consider rather banal. What do you
Yes.
think you do differently?
So the culture piece up front, like really selling the culture. I mean, down to I had a firm recently tell me about um, their perspective on like lunch spots in their city and how they really encourage that. Another firm does catered lunches and they're a hybrid. What's bringing people into the workplace? They think that this is something that's mentioned in the final interview as, hey, we have catered lunch. That's actually a huge incentive and it separates you from other firms.
Hmm.
The other thing I use is a lot of adjectives of the people that have stayed there for a long time. And then in the background, I also know this does not go into the job description, but I always ask the firm who didn't work and why, so that I
Hmm.
can use that to then spin it on who would work in the job description. The last thing I would say is that, it's short and sweet. There is no 3 5 page job description. I receive a lot of those and have to convert them. Nobody's reading
Yeah.
it. Nobody wants to know that they're going to be cleaning the kitchen once a week. It's just not necessary to go into the job description, right? If they have to fill the carrot,
Right.
like it's just not needed. And so, how can we construct it in a really simple way that people can scan it within 5 seconds, the way a recruiter would, and decide if they want to apply to or not?
Hmm. Okay, that's awesome. And then the scanner interviews, I that usually in the past, like I've done, say 10 to 20 minute phone interviews with people, sort of as a first round based on
Sure.
applications. Who am I interested in talking about? I'm curious about your practice, I've never heard it referred to as a scanner. So I love that you've added to my lexicon here. That's great.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about the scanners.
Sure. So they're 20 to 30 minutes. I would say for a position like a legal assistant, I leave 30 minutes blocked just
Yeah.
in case, because of course there's people that like to talk and there's people that may take 10 minutes because they're not giving me enough, as you know.
Oh
um,
yes.
but these 20 to 30 minute interviews, 20 minutes again, more legal support staff, 30 minutes, sometimes even 45 for like a senior associate. If I feel like I need to get to know them more, if it's a solo attorney that's looking to join a firm, I feel like that's a point where I need to ask many more questions to make sure that it's going to be a personality fit. But I'm able to weed out more candidates. And so I always get approval of the firm because obviously I'm representing them while I begin that first stage interview. But it's a good time to decide how can we narrow this a little bit down, a little bit more, so that then we
Hmm.
can decide who do we actually want to bring into the office and present to the partners at that time.
Okay. So, and at that point, when you're bringing them in, when does the actual law firm get involved with? Is that the point where now we're going to have people from the law firm itself involved in the interviews? Do you share custody of the applicant at that point? What does it look like?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I like that term. We do share custody. But I only do conduct this scanner. So I am not involved, like I'm not in the background, for example, or interviewing the candidates further from there. Every firm is different. I've had firms tell me before they come to me that they conduct one interview, and if it's great, they hire. I never encourage that. In fact, I don't even think two is enough. I think at least three. So I usually say one Zoom with myself, one Zoom with the firm, and then at least one interview in person. And that does need to be
Hmm.
with the firm owner because they're the final decision maker, and they're the inspiration of probably why that person also applied to that position. They're probably, I hire for a lot of woman owned, woman led firms. Those
Cool.
candidates do want to go ahead and meet the owner of the firms.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Earlier you talked about the sort of cost consideration in
Hmm.
hiring a team member. And that's
Yeah.
certainly an issue that I see pop up for a lot of firm owners. The idea of, oh, I want to get an associate for $60,000, or I want to get a
Sure.
senior attorney for 90 plus bonus.
Yeah.
From your perspective, and I know that you work in a lot of major metropolitan areas, but you also work out not necessarily in the sticks, but like in more suburban
Yeah.
areas surrounding metro zones.
Yes.
Uh, Trend wise,
Yeah.
like offering for salaries, what are you seeing?
Mm. It's very difficult. So I also won't hire if it's not enough for a position. So if there's based on the role, there's a minimum of what I'll hire for each role because it's not justified in my mind. And if we're looking at a culture perspective, they probably wouldn't be appreciated at a certain standpoint. And
Hmm.
with the economy, right? I mean, you can go work in retail at Target and be making, if we're adding those hours up, a certain minimum. And so we can't be where that is because we don't know where else they're interviewing. And if another firm is clearly going to give them more, we're kind of wasting our time, right? And so at that point, I might say maybe you want an hourly person or somebody contract versus full time if you can't pay the benefits. And benefits is a whole conversation because for a smaller firm, this may be the first time that they've ever brought on somebody, right? And how do we create a competitive comp package if we're not offering the highest medical we can or a really great medical plan? Can we make up for it in PTO or some other perk that will draw this person in? Salary wise, for smaller firms, I always encourage a fairly broad range so that, I really ask them what is actually in the budget. And then I pull market comps of what similar size firms and types of law firms are in
Hmm.
the area to figure out where are we from a competitive standpoint. Because maybe they don't always reveal this right away, but I'll tell them if I found your perfect candidate, how much would you be willing to pay, right? Because that's really the max. And so
Yes.
choosing that range, right, that makes sense. I also think about it from a filter perspective. When people apply to jobs on LinkedIn, for example, if a firm says, well, my salary is 145, and I'll ask them, can you potentially go to 150 from a search perspective? Not saying you have to pay that, but at
Right.
least so that it's falling within those limits.
That's fascinating because I often talk with firm owners sort of about like some of the brackets that go around pay zones
Yep.
where if you're leveling up to this level of talent, people who want that job, who are interested in that job, they're thinking in a minimum of say six figures, right? Like
Right.
$100,000 is their floor. So it's really interesting you talk about that. Now within the salary range, with most firms, are you usually having to say like, hey, do you mind if we search for better talent up higher, or versus coming in and saying, hey, you know what, it sounds like what you're looking for really is more of a junior associate level and the pay is actually appropriate at this level? How often are you adjusting that?
Usually after a first round of recruiting because we're seeing what we're getting. And so, if somebody, I have a position recently, paralegal, that, they said, here's our budget. That's fine, but let me show you what we're getting because maybe you don't really need 2 years. Maybe you need 1.5 because this person has this
Hmm.
exact experience. And so sometimes we're adjusting the job posting if they're finding, wow, okay, maybe it's not 2 years post grad, but they've done a few internships. They have a year and a half of really good experience. Can we consider this person? There's definitely adjustments in the process. I'd say maybe a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more for really specific, like senior associates, I find, because there's a lot of great talent out there. And while a number may sound great in the number of years of experience, what if they have everything else, right? It's just as if you are a candidate applying to a job. And I say, if there's this long list of qualifications and you don't have two of them, I would still apply because maybe you have the preferred experience. So yes, there's definitely adjustments after first rounds. And even after I share interview notes of my scanners, sometimes we adjust things from there. I'd say it depends on the size of a firm because 5,000 to 10,000 to one firm could make a huge difference
Right.
versus a larger firm, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's scale involved in all of these
Right.
decisions. So, uh, when you have, say, a smaller firm that maybe feels like they have limitations on salary, and in
Sure.
particular limitations on the benefits that they can give, how do you help them win in the talent market?
Mm. When they have the limitations on salary set or benefits.
With both, right? They're looking at the
Okay.
total comp package and
Okay.
they just feel like maxed out, stressed out. They're
Mm.
already at their upper limit and feel like they're having trouble competing for the talent that would make sense.
Okay. You're going to like this answer. I honestly tell them how much they're saving with me because my recruiter fee is so different. So I had this with a firm recently where, we were looking for talent and they're like, I was telling them we're not getting what you want at this rate and we're not going to because I have the market comps to prove it.
Right.
And we got somebody with talent there and they were asking me, obviously I will advise on what I think they should give for salary and it's their final choice, but they
Mhm.
were worried about it. And I said, but if you went and hired a recruiter, you've saved about like $35,000 through hiring me. And so through that process, they decided, okay, we would have spent this money. We've put it into this role. And now their recruiting budget for the entire year also did not need to be where it was. So we were able to take money from different areas. Sometimes I do have to say that a little bit more explicitly to them to be able to like lay out the math, right? And say, here's where this money could be coming from so that you can get this talent.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of comp, sometimes it's exploring different things. So if they have a very set policy internally, we can't always change PTO, right? Depending on what everybody else is on.
Mhm.
But sometimes it can also be with a bonus. Is this something that you would consider? Is there a commission or a profit sharing structure? If it's coming from the candidate side, for example, I have sometimes a candidate call me and they're like, listen, I really want this job, but I have to get here. You see this a lot with people in government based positions, like a public defender that has loan forgiveness. So they're like, well, I would
Ah,
love this salary, but I'm getting that loan forgiveness. So now I have to consider, is it actually worth it?
right.
At that point, I usually call the firm and tell me to sell me your benefit package. What is it that your firm probably has that the other doesn't? And I go back to the candidate and then we take the value of the benefits because their firm might not have that or if they've disclosed that to me. And usually that's a selling point if it's a really strong benefit package. Otherwise, you can lose a candidate to loan forgiveness. And, unfortunately, that does happen. Um, it
That's a
just is kind of
shame.
the way it is. That's hiring a young associate, though. That's why some of them are in those positions.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's what is known as a perverse incentive, and it is interesting. That's
Right.
definitely something I don't think a lot of, especially criminal defense attorneys who might be hiring out of the PD's office.
Yeah.
Definitely not something they're thinking about all that frequently, or folks who are looking for attorneys who have some trial experience to be able to stand
Right.
upright in a courtroom. That may
Yep.
be a big, potentially a
Yes.
very big
Yeah. Yeah.
outsized factor for them. Now,
Yep.
within the let's talk benefits a little bit because this is an area where I know for sure small firm owners struggle. Like I've worked with firm owners who are doing, say, $1 million a year in revenue
Mhm.
and have not yet put a 401k in place, for example,
Mm.
who they have 5 people on the team, but all 5 people that they've hired are people who have a spouse who's had health care. So they've never really had to think about that before. And they start looking at, okay, now I'm not going to be trying to hire one person at a time. I'm really starting to hire maybe 2, 3
Yeah.
people ahead of myself. And I want to put together a good benefits package that doesn't completely break the bank. So I'm curious on you kind of mentioned like PTO structure and within benefits, what can
Mhm.
be offered outside of I'm directly putting cash into this, even though giving
Sure.
PTO is in a way putting cash into it, as you and I both know. What are some of those non-immediate cash outlays that
Yeah. Good
look
question.
good?
Yep. I love this part because a lot of them don't realize that it is a benefit and I list it as a benefit. So it's very, like last night, a conversation with a new firm, and I was like, what's your benefits? And of course, they said PTO, medical, dental, right? I'm like, but what else? What else do
Hmm.
you offer that maybe another firm offers, but how do you offer it? So the first thing I would say is if a firm, it's depending on the wording. So just coming down to like healthcare, for example, let's just start with the basics, healthcare and PTO. I'm hiring for a firm recently that they offer every employee's birthday, they get that off. That stands out in a job posting. So we mention it. Phrasing things like unlimited sick time, things like along those lines that we don't want people to take advantage of, right? Um, what's something else in terms of the extra benefits, professional development budgets? Do you pay for CLEs? Do you pay for bar memberships? That's a huge benefit. If it's a support staff position, do you pay for a paralegal certification? That's huge. A lot of people want that if not required. Something else that I would say is big too is I list hybrid as a benefit now because a lot of firms are fully back in person.
Hmm.
Transit checks. So if you're in a city, do you pay commuter benefits? A lot of candidates are asking that. For example, I'm in New York City. For candidates in Westchester, they always ask if it's covered. It's expensive to come into the city,
Right.
right? Um, I would say those are the biggest things that I find, but catered lunch. If you don't have the cost of, say, $25 a week for just 2 days in the office, that's a savings. And I would consider that a benefit. So thinking about where you're potentially saving the candidate time or money is
Right.
huge. So we talked about that. And then bonus doesn't have to be bonus. It could be commission. It could be profit sharing. And then last thing I'll say is matching 401k. And then a lot of people don't say if they have these really small policies, like a legal shield policy or pet insurance. People are having kids later. If you have pet insurance, I absolutely want to see it in a job posting.
Interesting. Okay, that is definitely a low cost thing that could be
Super low cost,
advertised. Yeah,
right?
that's fascinating.
Yeah,
And then what about some of like the you mentioned like a catered lunch, and then there are sometimes the quirky benefits, right? There's the quarterly happy hour, or
sure.
taco Tuesday, stuff like that. Like, is there a point at which you kind of go that's just leaning into like Silicon Valley nonsense versus
Sure.
practical benefit?
Yeah, it's always an interesting conversation because sometimes firms think that they're really unique, that they like throw a holiday party or that they
There you go.
have, a monthly lunch, and it's not. And I actually don't want to point those things out because if one firm hosts a monthly lunch versus another firm that's getting catered lunch twice a week on their hybrid schedule, then I probably don't want to advertise that it's only once a month, right? So
That's fair.
it has to really be strategic in the sense of how amazing is it? Have I heard of this benefit before? Is it, does it, from your employees' perspective, why have they said they want to keep having this at the firm? So you have to be very careful. I have had a lot of firms say, we have a holiday party. Most firms have a holiday party, right? But in the description, I will say, that there's incentives. I had another firm one time tell me that there was a silent auction item that was donated to that employee because they had worked really hard that year. So we're not saying explicitly, hey, you might receive a silent auction item, but we're saying you are rewarded for your hard work outside of just the benefit compensation package.
That makes a lot of sense. And then, do you in job postings, how much talk of mission, purpose, values, like the core values, do you do
Mhm.
in those job descriptions
Yeah,
or
good
in the
question. I would say I
ads?
hit on values more than anything else because that's what the culture is built upon. If something is, I always list a website. I don't hyperlink it in a job description, but I do list it. And
Yeah.
so that makes me in an interview know, did you go do your research? If the firm owner has a podcast, did you listen to the podcast before the interview, right? How much research did you do? But I find that mission and purpose is very clear. And it's overly stated in most job descriptions. So I actually
Hmm.
steer away a little bit from that and I lean more into the values of the firm and what are they looking to do long term. For example, it's very common with trust and estates for them to be family oriented people. I see this time and time again, and then they are like that with their employees as well. And it's a nice segue to bring together like what it is that they do and then how they give their employees that flexibility.
Yeah.
And I'm a wordsmith, so I absolutely love tying that all together and selling it in that way of come to a place where you're supporting these people, but also receiving
Mm.
the same treatment, behind. Or if somebody, if the firm is owned by two partners, that's a mother and a father, not necessarily that they're married, but they have families themselves, then it's really helpful to say that in a way that we are coming from a place of we have families too and we understand. Thinking about, is it a junior associate or a senior associate role? Are they likely to have family or not? So you have to think definitely outside of the box. But
Mm.
I like just doing the intake on essentially having a firm owner just tell me, why they started. What is their passion behind this? Usually, the way their passion for their clients goes back a lot into the firm for their employees. They don't always realize that,
Yeah.
but those usually are interconnected.
Makes a lot of sense. So, Erin, before I ask you the last little three-part question, if people want to learn more about you and what you do, what's the best place to direct them to?
Sure. LinkedIn is great. I'm on there, Erin Andersen. My last name is Essian at the end. I always say that to make sure for spelling. My email is info@yourbrandnetworker.com. So I'd say either of those two places would be a great place to find me and inquire. And then I always have testimonials on my LinkedIn as well.
Fantastic. So, Erin, last little question for you. What are you reading, watching, and listening to these days?
Ooh, okay. So I just finished The Gilded Age and about to start Succession because it has come highly recommended.
It's a
Uh,
good one.
It's yeah, I know. It's definitely something I would like to work on next. And I'm not a huge TV watcher, so that's a challenge for me actually.
That's fair.
Um, Listening to, I'm a huge podcast listener. So I like Project Me with Tiffany Carter. I'm also a big Jenna Kutcher fan on occasion when it makes sense for my business. And I do like Guy Raz's podcast as well, talking about the founder stories of how they've started. The
How I
Airbnb is
Built This?
actually my favorite. How I Built This, yes,
Yes.
that's a good
Yes.
one. When you've used the product or service, it's even better.
Absolutely.
And reading. I actually just finished a lot of books that were on my summer list. But there is one that I just actually purchased, and I'm going to double check. But before I say that, because my favorite book is The Science of Getting Rich, and I read it every single, excuse me, not, that's one of my favorites. My other one is um, How You Change Yourself, and that is the habit. I have it on my bookshelf, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. So I every August I reread that before the fall.
Awesome.
And then there was a book that is in my cart right now, and it's called Buy Back Your Time. That's the book that I'll be reading
Fantastic
next.
book. Yes,
Yes.
that is an excellent choice, Erin.
Yeah.
We were just talking about it at the mastermind group in Miami. Fantastic book. You will enjoy that a lot, I can assure you. I
Awesome.
consider it canonical among my business books now.
Definitely. I have quite the to-do list.
Excellent. So, Erin, thank you so much for sharing your insider perspective, all of this extra information about hiring, this kind of complex landscape that
Sure.
is faced down by firm owners. And truly, I recommend anyone listening to this do reach out to Erin. Get connected with her. She is doing things differently than any of the other recruiters that I've been in contact with, and I've been pretty impressed with what she's had to say. And I've recommended a couple of people to her already. So, again, reach out to her, yourbrandnetworker.com, and all the other good contact information down in the notes below. Erin, thank you again for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charlie.
And we will see you all in the next episode of They Don't Teach This in Law School.